Right. This is an example of using Adobe Connect to introduce the next speaker, who is Chris Ridgewell, who's chairman of the UK Telework Association. This is software that we use ourselves to have meetings and for webinars and various other reasons. So all I'm doing really here is introducing the subject. You'll see Chris is in a window above me, and in a minute I'll disappear and Chris will take over and do the presentation. Chris has been the chairman of the Telework Association for 4 or 5 years now. I've known him for 20 years maybe. He's got a long association with teleworking and flexible working in general. We work together on a number of projects. And one of his areas of expertise is the whole area of regulation and health and safety and legislation and so on. So I'm very pleased to introduce Chris, who's going to talk to you today about remote working regulations from a UK and to some extent a European viewpoint. So over to you, Chris.
Thank you, Peter. Yes, and hello everyone. What I want to cover in this short presentation, only about 10 minutes or so, is the main emphasis of regulations and law in the UK as it relates to remote working and all forms of flexible working. And you'll see that it is driven in part by the European legislation itself. This is a rather packed overview of the regulations. You'll see at the top of the slide the European Union, UK as a member of the Union. As European Union issues directives, the UK tends to implement most of them word for word, which is good and bad in some cases. It's also worthy of note that if a body command actually mentions a directive or cites it, then that body command is also meant to be implemented by the member countries, and again the UK tends to do that. The European directives come down to the UK through the Houses of Parliament, and we then enact them either in law and then in turn by regulations, and it's those regulations that I'm really talking about today. A good example of the way the European directives pass right through into the UK legal system is all that great block of regulations to do with data protection and information security, and I'll cover that a bit later on. In general, with regard to remote working, the regulations refer to things like the employment terms and conditions, to some extent local planning regulations, which I'll cover in a moment, the workplace itself, working time, and also in the UK we have implemented for the last 8 years or so the right for employees to request flexible working, and again I'll cover that. At the very end of the presentation you'll see a list of useful websites that might help you and give you some pointers as to where to look for more information. Firstly, the employment terms and conditions. It's worth noting that if there is any dispute and it does get to a court of law, it's these employment terms and conditions which every employee must have that really dictate what the decision of the court will be. So they have to be very specific. They must include things like job descriptions and to some extent describe the duties and the work tasks involved. There's a great emphasis in the UK on equality, so it must ensure that every employee, no matter where they work or when they work, have equal access to training, promotion prospects compared to all their other working colleagues. Rates of pay, allowances and expenses should be included in those terms and conditions, and to some extent you'll see in remote working applications statements about the provision of equipment and services, IT, support, insurance cover and so on. Big thing there is whether the equipment supplied actually remains the property of the employer or whether in fact the remote worker themselves can provide their own equipment and under what terms and conditions they connect to networks. They should cite other policies like IT, data security and so on, as well as the expenses policies. The term should also emphasise the times of work that are expected as well as the places of work, and that can have implications for things like paying income tax, national insurance contributions and so on. So it's quite important to get those right, not only from the employer's point of view but from the employees as well. I mentioned local planning regulations. In the UK in the past there have been some instances of local authorities, local councils, applying the business rate to home workers, although now I don't know of any current examples of that happening, and it seems to have dropped away. Generally, local authority regulations refer to several key areas. One is whether the remote worker perhaps working at home will generate any extra noise as a result of their work, whether they'll produce any extra waste and how they're going to dispose of it. We have quite strict environmental laws here which have to be obeyed by businesses and employees wherever they work. Also, especially local traffic. If you're going to hold meetings at home, will that increase local traffic? Will it have impact on your neighbours in terms of car parking and road use? And those seem to be the key areas where local authorities want to know what's going on. And in most cases, the employer has standard letters they can give to the employee to give to their local authority just to explain what's going on. Generally, it isn't a problem. I mentioned data protection and information security. The key area here is the Data Protection Act 1998 and all the subsequent regulations that have been issued there about how people handle data, how they manage it, how they keep it secure, and finally how they dispose of that data. Wherever the remote worker is working, be it on the move or at home or in public places, they must have regard to these and have adequate procedures in place. There have been significant fines on some employers where they've got this wrong and been found wanting. Basically, it needs adequate planning. The little photo here shows someone working in a bar. When I walked past that gentleman, I could actually see quite confidential client information on the screen. That would be a breach of the Data Protection Act if someone reported it. So again, you need to think quite carefully about that. As I've travelled around Europe, I've seen less emphasis on this part of the legislation, and it's something that does need to be checked on. The workplace. Firstly, what we call occupational safety and health, and there are lots of regulations that apply here, and it's worthy to note that it's wherever someone is working and whenever someone is working, doing work for you, the employer. The areas that are mainly concerned here are hygiene at work, managing stress in the workplace, work-related illnesses, training and awareness, and especially the ergonomic use of equipment and furniture. And the photo here, although it's a bit contrived, shows a woman sitting in a chair, not very comfortably, with one laptop on her lap and another one resting on her legs resting on a rather rickety looking table. Clearly that is not an adequate sort of working place, is not compliant with legislation. People working at home generally should have normal office equipment, height adjustable desk, height adjustable chair, adequate lighting so there's no glare from the window as you can see in this case. Also things like fire regulations, which I'll touch on in a minute. Basically it's common sense. In terms of health and safety, in the UK we have over 200 different laws and more than 200 regulations in current force. They are now being rationalised to some extent. It's worthy of note that employers and employees both have a duty of care to themselves and others in the areas that they're working in. So basically we have to go through usually a 5-point risk assessment to see what those risks might be, come up with plans about how we manage the risks, look at personal safety, look at the fire precautions and escape routes if you're working at home or even in a neighbourhood office. There are strict procedures about reporting accidents and injuries while at work, wherever that work is done. A lot about lighting and ventilation, and also covering the office furniture and equipment, especially IT displays and the use of those, and also really general requirements about training and making people aware. If people are working at home, they can in fact do a self-assessment, which would be more than adequate, providing it meets certain guidelines set by the employer and meets legislation. Generally, again, anything that applies in the office should apply to wherever and whenever work is done elsewhere. That does include as well working in cars, so no using mobile phones when you're driving, no using laptops when you're driving, which I have actually seen done in Germany on occasion on the autobahns. Not very safe. The Working Time Directive has now been in force for some years here. It does apply to all employees, again no matter where they are working and when they're working. The legislation here specifies the maximum hours to be worked in certain periods, usually over a fortnight's time, and here the maximum is usually about 48 hours a week. In France it's currently 35, although that again might well be reduced to around about 30 in the very near future. The legislation also specifies paid and unpaid holiday times and how you may take breaks for things like childcare and emergency situations. It also specifies the number of rest periods each day. Some employers actually regulate this by forbidding people to access their online systems remotely at certain times of the day, so people have to take a break. It also specifies certain groups of workers who may opt out of these regulations, people like doctors, firefighters and so on. And it's quite a comprehensive set of regulation. We have implemented most of it here in the UK. I mentioned the right to request. This was introduced in April 2003 in the UK to a very limited number of employees, and it did actually raise questions about if people are equal opportunities employers, how they can actually continue to be equal opportunities employers if they only implement this for certain classifications of employees such as working mothers, working fathers, carers. It has since been extended several times to include more groups of employees, and fairly shortly, probably next year, the government here aims to extend that right to all employees in organisations. Businesses must meet very strict timelines in which to respond to requests they receive for flexible working practices. Businesses can turn down the request, but only if certain criteria are met. And there are usually 12 specified conditions which they can use. The employees themselves must meet certain criteria before applying, and things like how long they've worked for the employee or the organisation. It does cover people moving around between subsidiaries of the same companies as well, by the way. If it is extended to all employees, then usually what happens is that the employee concerned makes a business case through a known internal procedure, maybe to their personnel department or through their line manager, which presents the business case. That should include an impact statement, taking into account the impact that working condition might have on other members of a team, for example. Generally, the regulations here are being simplified quite considerably, so it should make it easier from next year. And finally, just to finish, this is a group of websites that you might find quite useful. First of all, to look within Europe about legislation and summaries, and if you go to europa.eu, you'll find very useful summaries of all the employment regulation there, specifically as it applies to remote working. ULX as well is quite useful. In the UK, obviously the Telework Association can help there. For health and safety, the Health and Safety Executive and their publications division, HSE Books, is quite useful and can give you downloadable Adobe Acrobat PDF documents which help. Anywhere Working, a UK consortium, which Telework Association now works, can also give guidance that might be relevant to your organisation. And finally, Flexibility, which is an online monthly journal, again with lots of case studies about how people have implemented this thing. That's it from me, I guess, in a very short summary there. If you do have any more questions, then I'm quite happy to take them either now or at a later date, and we can give you some email contacts later on. Thank you for your time. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Chris. I just have one question before we complete, because you've covered an awful lot of regulation there. Is this something, though, that has put off small businesses particularly from implementing remote working and flexible working? Is it something that they use as a reason for not putting in place flexible working?
I think initially, Peter, it was, and if you look at the uptake of various forms of flexible working, not just home working, but working on the move and so on, smaller businesses, especially those with under 10 employees, didn't seem to do it very much. Slightly larger employees, like up to maybe 500 staff, did begin to implement it. If you look at the latest figures coming out of government and out of various surveys by CIPD, the Federation for Smaller Businesses here, it does now seem that smaller businesses across all business sectors are now implementing flexible working because of the benefits they gain. And if they do a sort of benefit analysis, I think if they provide enough input and preparation work over time, they will see more benefits coming out, and I think that's why they're now implementing it. It's certainly seen as a productivity tool, a way of increasing efficiencies, sweating your assets is something we talk about here, whether it's making better use of smaller offices, getting more out of people, and so on. So it does seem now that smaller businesses are taking up in quite some large numbers.
Okay, that's good. So basically, that it's not put people off. They are still managing to implement new ways of working of all sorts, particularly home working and remote working.
Yep.
Okay, thank you very much, Chris. That's been very informative. On behalf of the people at the conference in Třebíči, thank you very much for your contribution, and good luck with the UK Telework Association. Thank you very much.
Thank you.